he comes to her exactly where she's at. She's been denied an education her whole life. She's only heard stuff. And so he says to her, I who speak to you am he. It's a direct self-disclosure of who Jesus is. Oftentimes we think these injustices are happening in our midst, and the Bible's often to blame. So let me go through a couple of things here and just talk through a couple of points, because if the Bible actually were a book that fostered prejudices, especially racial prejudices and especially gender prejudices, where it was sexist and racist, what you'd expect is to see it rife in the book and full of it. And I know a lot of atheists and skeptics will say, absolutely, look at this law and look at this law, and the Bible condones slavery, and the Bible condones women being treated as property and makes women marry their rapists, and all this, and it seems a terrible oppressive book to both people of color and women as well. And so this is a big issue, So we have to go and talk through these things one by one. But what you wouldn't expect to find, if the Bible were truly racist and sexist, you wouldn't expect to find a story where Jesus, the central figure of the entire book, addresses someone of a racial difference who's also a woman and treat her with respect. You wouldn't expect to find that. In fact, you wouldn't expect to find the story that you do find in John chapter 4. It's the story of the Samaritan woman. I want you to read this story once again on your own at some point, if you could, with some of the things I'm going to say in mind, okay? So Jesus, the story says that Jesus has to walk through Samaria. He has to go through Samaria. Now, this is interesting to me because in the beginning of John chapter 4, it says Jesus has to go through Samaria, but the reality was he didn't have to go through Samaria. Logistically speaking, he could have gone around it, like all Jews did. You see, Samaritans were considered an ethnic half-breed. They were considered an ethnic half-breed based on the Babylonian exile. They married and intermarried with other peoples outside of the nation of Israel, and they were religious and ethnic half-breeds. They were outcasts, racially speaking. They were outcasts on this. And so Jesus is encountering a Samaritan woman in Samaria, a place that hates Jews, and Jews hate right back. You can't get more racially divided than the Jews and the Samaritans, especially of the time. And so Jesus has to go through Samaria. What I picture here is not that he logistically thinks, oh man, I got to go through Samaria. It's more like, I have to go. I have to go. There's an impulsion here. So he goes, and the disciples go off, and they go to find food in the village. Their dander is already up. They're ready to, them's fighting words kind of a thing. They're ready to get ridiculed and picked on and maybe do some of it themselves. And they go off to find food, and Jesus is there at Jacob's well. He sits there, and a woman from Samaria comes up to him. And maybe you know the story well, but she's got a checkered past. And some scholars think that the reason why she's had five husbands and now living with a sixth man who's not her husband, the reason for that might not be because she has loose morals, but because she's been used and abused over and over again by different men for different reasons. And she walks up. Think of the fear that a Samaritan has, an ethnic minority, judged harshly, walks up to a well where she's got to get water. She's by herself, which tells Jesus a whole lot because women did not travel to get water by themselves for safety reasons and for social reasons, and yet she's by herself, which tells Jesus that her own village rejects her. She walks up to this well, and there's a Jewish man sitting there. Not only is there racial tension, but now there's a gender disparity as well because women didn't talk to rabbis. The rabbis said things like this, like it's better to bury the law in the ground than to teach it to a woman. Women have no faculties whatsoever mentally except with a spindle or in the kitchen. These are the rabbis of Jesus' day talking. It is more dangerous to walk behind a woman than it is to walk in front of a hungry lion. Not a high view. And this is what she's walking up to. And then he says, can you give me a drink? And she says something more profound than I think she realized. She said, how will you draw? For the well is deep. She's talking to the deepest well there is. And this story, I've read this story so many times, and I get new truths out of it all the time. The story of the woman of Samaria talking to Jesus in John chapter 4 is itself a deep well. That's amazing to me all by itself. And then he unmasks her bit by bit, and he starts talking to her about her social issues, her racial issues, because she's got a chip on her shoulder when it comes to Jews. For a reason, too. It's not like it's just out of nowhere. And she's got her issues when it comes to men. And he dismantles all of that and says, the Father is not looking for people to worship in this mountain or in this temple or whatever it might be. He's looking for those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And he tells her things that no one else could possibly know. And this simple woman who's broken with all her history talks to him and says to him, when Messiah comes, he's going to tell us everything about us. Almost like, hey, when Messiah comes, I heard he's going to tell us everything about us. Maybe you could tell me a few things. She's almost hoping he's going to say, I'm the Messiah. Now, to everybody else, all the highfalutin, scholars of the law, whether it's scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, whatever sees who come up to him, he always refers to the Old Testament in some, not cryptic, but in a way that says, see these prophecies? You should know these things by now. It's about me. But to her, he comes to her exactly where she's at. She's been denied an education her whole life. She's only heard stuff. And so he says to her, I who speak to you am he. It's a direct self-disclosure of who Jesus is. She's so excited about this man that she leaves the water jug there, which is why she went in the first place, got no water, runs back to a village that hates her, tells all of them, by the way, come meet this Jewish man who you all should hate. Maybe he's the Messiah. Something in her eyes, something in her voice compelled an entire village to spend 3 days with Jesus. Samaritans who hate who hate Jews, spent 3 days with a Jewish man and then believed he was the Messiah. The first cross-cultural missionary was neither Jewish nor a man. It was a woman. You look through that lens at the rest of the Bible, and you begin to see some beautiful things.